الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم على سيدنا مولانا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. Alhamdulillah, it's very nice to be here with you all, and that there's nothing more that I would rather spend my time than that, not so much talking to you as just delving into this whole process of knowledge and reflection, and that once someone opens up their heart to intellectual stimulation, and that they find the beauty of a constant pursuit of seeking of knowledge, is that really what comes to dominate the heart is an overwhelming love for what is known. And that Imam al-Ghazali has a very interesting hierarchy of desire that he purports in his book Kitab al-Arba'in, the book of 40, and that he says that the human being at successive stages in his life has various shahawat, desires start to form within them. And that he says the very first desire to form within the human being is the desire to eat and drink. And this is obvious because we see that as soon as a baby enters into the world, that the first thing that happens, as we see as a manifestation for us as God's name, the Hadi, the guide, is that the baby somehow intuitively knows to reach for their mother's breast. And that this is very significant. You know, how to explain that? Okay, instinct. Well, what is instinct? What is that phenomenon? How is that taking place? And we have a unique perspective on it. But this is the very first instinct that exists, and the very first desire that exists within the human being is to eat and drink. A natural inclination exists within the human being for obvious reasons. If we don't have a desire to eat and drink, then how would we be able to preserve our physical health? And that we recognize therein that these natural desires in and of themselves is that they're not something negative. In fact, that there's a divine wisdom behind them. That if the Lord of the heavens and the earth had willed that we eat other types of food, like rocks or pebbles, or leaves, or just nourishment that was entirely bland, or we didn't have taste buds, or we didn't have desire, for instance, that it would be a lot more difficult to be able to preserve our health as human beings. And that there's, in alternative forms of medicine that deal with holistic health, there's a lot to be said for desiring particular foods at particular times. Now, that doesn't mean that you reach for M&Ms and Starburst and Mentos and these types of things. That's not what it's referring to. But at times you do find that you incline towards some types of food as opposed to others. And that some will say that this is an indication that that's actually what you need in that moment, obviously with certain conditions. But he says that the next desire that develops within the human being, after these basic desires of eating and drinking, is that the desire for copulation, that the desire that the sexes have for the opposite sex. And that this is a desire that comes a bit later in the stage. And this is a natural desire in and of itself, that it's not a negative thing. That there's obviously great wisdom behind that. That were females not attracted to men, or men not attracted to females, then how would we then procure the human race? How would we preserve the human race? And the very fact that there's a desire there that has obvious divine wisdom in it. But again, like the other desires, that it has to be regulated and it has to be channeled, and that limits have to be set up of proper engagement in that. And then Imam al-Ghazali says is that as that the human years progress, that a third type of desire starts to develop in the human being, and what he calls the desire for status, the desire for rank, the desire to be known by people. And that this is the third level, and again also that has wisdom in and of itself. And he goes into a detailed discussion of status and when it is desirable, when it is praiseworthy, when it is blameworthy, but the basic level of which, clearly, according to Imam Ghazali, is needed. That if there's not a type of trust, or if you're not known by certain people, that they perceive you to be a certain way, that they're not going to hire you, they're not going to interact with you, they're not going to give you their business. So there's a certain level that has to be there, and that there's mechanisms in the sacred law that preserve this. And we have what is called muru'ah, which, it's a difficult word to translate, like a lot of other words in Arabic, but it's broadly defined as legal respectability, right? Someone's reputation. And we have a hadith of our Prophet ﷺ, the Prophet Muhammad said that al-mu'min la yudhillu nafsahu, that the believer doesn't humiliate themselves. So preserving your reputation is a good thing. Now, that we have to clarify in this day and age, that when you hear of things like honor killings and these type of things, that a'udhu billah, that we seek refuge in God, these type of things that are complete extremes, and that these things have nothing to do with Islam whatsoever. This is something totally jahili and ignorant, and has nothing to do with the way of the Prophet or Islam, and it needs to be categorically spoken out against and condemned. But that the basic level, though, of preserving your reputation, right, has to be there. But Imam Ghazali will go into great detail then about how these different types of desires can be balanced, and that all of the various afat or defects that arise when they are imbalanced in one or two directions. But we're going down this course to get to the fourth type of desire, which Imam Ghazali argues is the most fundamental and simultaneously the strongest desire that exists within the human being, which is the desire to know. But this is something that is deeply embedded within the human being, a desire to know. And that this represents the fourth so-called desire in the hierarchy of shahawat, of desires. And again, though, that like the other three, that we have to have a balanced perspective of that the way in which we know, and how we seek what we know, and what we do with what we know. And I think you could argue from a religious perspective that a lot of the problems of the modern world that stem from all of these, you can see very clearly how they relate to problems in the modern world, all of these, in the various imbalances, respective imbalances. But, really, at the fourth degree, which even though in terms of numbers, that there might be less people that are part of this imbalance, but the repercussions that they reverberate into all people, and that it's related to how we know and what we do with what we know. But that what I'm trying to get at here is that a Muslim should love knowledge, and we should love intellectual stimulation, and that we should never feel hesitant to take part in any type of discussion, whether it be with people that are operating from a religious perspective, or whether it be people that are operating from a secular perspective. And that at the heart of every believer should be a fervent, ardent desire for truth. And that we happen to believe, despite postmodern conviction, that there is truth with a capital T. Now, our epistemology through which we affirm that is another topic of discussion. We tried to point to that briefly in the khutbah, but that's a more lengthy discussion. But the point is here is that we have clearly defined parameters that relate to how we know, but this should be at the very heart of a believer. And what is understood in this hierarchy that Imam Ghazali is saying is that the higher that you move up, the more fine-tuned one's taste is. And so that there is a quote that I believe that it was Eleanor Roosevelt, if I'm not mistaken, and that she said that the different types of people, that the lowest degree are people who talk about other people. And you see people that are like this, people that go through the line in the grocery store and they pick up People's Magazine. Or even worse, that they're picking up the National Enquirer. And if people weren't reading that, they wouldn't publish it. Right? There's people that actually like that type of literature. And that their whole life revolves around other people. And lifestyles of the rich and famous. I know I'm outdated. I don't know what in God's name they have now. But I guess they're running out of ideas, so let's just do reality TV. But I don't know what the lifestyles of the rich and famous is old school. I haven't had a TV for like 16 years. We figured out last night, so I don't know. But whatever it is, with the whole idea of living your life through other people's lives, that there's a really nice book by an author by the name of Chris Hedges. He's a graduate of the Harvard Divinity School, and he's an intense social critic, which I would highly recommend. Many of his books, but in particular, his book, War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning, as well as his book titled The Empire of Illusion. And that he says the subtitle is that the triumph of spectacle and the loss of literacy, or something along that lines. And he has 5 different chapters, all of which are interesting. The chapter on pornography is very important, but it's very vivid, so you might want to just breeze over that. He has a very powerful critique of the modern university. But the first chapter, it relates to the way that people live their lives through these various programs that are presented to us in media. And that he says that a lot of the type of programs now that in my day, again, please excuse me, I'm outdated, it was called the WWF, now I guess it's called the WWE, is that right? That people live their lives, and it's developed such that people can have a psychological release, that when they start to look at these lives of these people, that what they start to do is live through them in various ways. And that's why, do you know what the most popular show is in the Muslim world? In the Arab world? What would you think? The most popular show in the Arab world?
Arabino.
No, but it's a Western show. Baywatch. Right? Who watches Baywatch anymore? Does anyone watch Baywatch anymore? Right? Baywatch. And if you would look at the number of people that feel inclined towards Oprah Winfrey, and that follow, and we're talking about oftentimes in very conservative societies that are completely segregated, like Saudi Arabia, that there's thousands and thousands of women, really, without exaggeration, that learn to live their life through Oprah because they feel like that she's speaking to them, and that they learn to live their lives through these characters and so forth that she brings on her talk show and so forth. And that there's a lot of people that are like this, is that their whole discussion is around people. And then that a higher degree, according to President Roosevelt, is that people whose discussion is around events. Then there's other people that they talk about events and interpreting events. And you have to have more of a background knowledge to be able to discuss an event. Which again, that I would argue that most people, that when they see events on television, they don't have the background knowledge to even understand those events. Because that if you look at a book like Neil Postman's How to Watch TV News, and you see the way that a 30-minute or even hour-long news segment is presented, right, the substance of the topic at hand is, at best minimal. And oftentimes it's presented in a particular frame. In order to really develop your own opinion on it, is that you have to do actually a lot of reading, a background reading. And that oftentimes you actually have to visit the place. And as a person who has a foot literally in 2 worlds, the West and the East, I own a home in a controversial country, Yemen, which I've only had beautiful experiences there for the most part, that you see very clearly that the way that perspectives on both sides, if you want me to be fair, are skewed and distorted. And that you see the pitch in the media compared to what you know on the ground, and you start to see that if that's a person's only source of information, that they're not going to be able to develop an opinion. And it's actually, for myself, really quite annoying that you get these people that are like parrots, where they don't have any idea what they're talking about, but they're just like, they hear something on CNN or NBC, or some, some broadcaster is giving them an opinion, or some so-called expert, or political analyst, and that they don't think from themselves. They're just presenting what they heard. That if you really get down to the nitty-gritty and like, how do you develop your opinion, and why do you think that, right? Well, how can you have that particular opinion if you've never exposed yourself to a different opinion? That how could you develop that? So this is the second degree. She then says that the highest level of inquiry, intellectual inquiry, is where you start to discuss ideas. You start to discuss concepts. And that is where it really gets interesting. Is starting to discuss ideas and concepts. And that, we do have mechanisms in the sacred law that at times you see, like for instance in the topic of philosophy, traditional scholars differed about what was the legal ruling of philosophy. Some of them said philosophy is haram. That opinion does exist. And that the way that position is understood, if people don't have a philosophical mind, that it's better to have them focus on orthopraxy, which is, orthopraxy relates to that uprightness of behavior, right? That you focuses on behavior, as opposed to orthodoxy, which is focused more upon that rightness of belief. Where in the Christian tradition there was much more focus on orthodoxy as opposed to orthopraxy, and that this is actually a blessing for us if we look at it from an overarching historical vantage point. That we have in the Fatiha, in the last two chapters, in the last two verses, غَيْرِ الْمَغْضُوبِ عَلَيْهِمْ وَلَا الضَّالِينَ, not the ways of those who have incurred your wrath, nor the way of those who have gone astray. Giving us the two basic archetypes for human deviation. That one is having a knowledge of something, but having the lower passions overcome you such that you don't act according to the dictates of what you know. The second archetype are those that actually have skewed knowledge and a skewed perspective, and thus lead themselves astray. And so these are the two basic paradigms. But that if you see that historically, that our scholars have inclined more towards orthopraxy in general than orthodoxy. And one of the great proofs of that is if you go into any traditional library, that what are the most voluminous books? What sciences do we have that the largest collections of books are what? Fiqh, tamam. I heard fiqh from someone. And what else?
Muhammad.
Right? Well, that's fiqh. Right? Hadith. Fiqh and hadith. Whereas if you compare that to Christendom, that the quintessential science was theology, hands down. And if you look at a book like, two of the most famous scholars of Christian history, that St. Thomas Aquinas and that Augustine, is that Aquinas is that Summa Theologica, that it's primarily a book of theology, right? And then if you look at Augustine's The City of God or his Confessions, that it's primarily a work of theology. That was the science that was of most importance. Whereas our scholars have a very clear-cut, developed theology. And that's a whole topic, the way that we present our theology. Creed, as opposed to some of the more nuanced understandings of experiential theology, of how we understand the soul and how it relates to the higher realms and so forth. That never became mainstream. That was always dealt in an entirely different genre, such that the onlookers that first looked at the Islamic tradition thought that we had a very basic, rudimentary theology, which, from the standpoint of creed, it is basic, which is the power of Islam, in which one of the main 5 reasons surveys have shown that people actually become Muslim is because of the simplicity and clarity of Muslim belief, where you're not required to believe some abstruse point of theology that even the Archbishop himself might understand. Except just it's how it is. It's a mystery. Accept it. Right? No, you actually. Allah says in the Quran, "Fa'lam annahu la ilaha illallah." it is a Qur'anic imperative, it's a Qur'anic injunction that you know God. Know that there is no God but Allah. Meaning that the scholars have said that far from being a voluntary matter, that if you have the intellect to come to know God, meaning what we attribute to God on a rational basis, which is the whole science of discursive or speculative theology, that it's an obligation for you to do so. And if you don't, you're actually sinning. That's the dominant position of our theologians. And so there's an encouragement to that. But so we do have a very developed theology, but the largest books of ours are in the realm of fiqh, in the realm of hadith. And then after that, you could probably say tafsir. And then there's a number of other aspects of our tradition as well. Tafsir is commentary on the Qur'an. But this is actually a blessing that we see looking back in retrospect, that if we're going to lean to one way or another, that there is more of a lean towards orthopraxy. That's actually a blessing. Right? But taking back to the whole point of this discussion is that as people who believe in Islam, that it's very important for us to have intellectual courage. Is that we should never be afraid to compare what we believe to what other people believe. That we should welcome that. And we should welcome inquiry. And we should welcome challenges. And we should welcome questions. And that we should welcome criticism. And what you'll find is when you do that, that when there is intellectual honesty, is that it will solidify. And this is my own personal experience, having left the university, gone the traditional route, studying in those places, not as long, was exaggerated, as he said, but that studying in those places, then coming back and re-entering the university. And for me, that the university has been a wonderful experience. And I actually have very good relationships with a lot of my professors, that some of them are secular Muslims. And I am who I am. I don't try to be other than myself. I dress as I dress in the university, outside the university. This is who I am. I don't really care if people like it or not. But this is who I am, and I'm going to be who I am. And that, at the same time, I have a professor of mine who's a complete atheist, and sometimes even makes fun of religious people. But we have a very, very close relationship. Not close relationship, we have a very good working relationship. And and I think that what it is that he appreciates, the intellectual honesty, is that we have to access our tradition, analyze it as it is. And we should never be worried about doing that. Whether it's from within our own ranks, in critically analyzing, and at times scrutinizing, certain positions of scholars of the past, with balance and adab, taking into consideration that people didn't always live in the modern world. And if I can just stop and take a quick tangent before getting to that, this is one of the major blinders of people in our time, is that when you try to look back upon history, is that most people cannot, and you could argue philosophically that you can never possibly do it, but having lived literally in a pre-modern society that doesn't even have running water and electricity, that it really is interesting to see the perspective of people that are operating in a pre-modern mentality. Because there is a lot of people in the world in general, and you might even be able to argue, I don't know if it would reach a majority, but there's a large percentage of the world that's still operating in a pre-modern mentality. Where I don't, I've seen too many beautiful people overseas to think, that they're like heathens or they're, backwards, and I don't buy that stuff. To me, one of the most, in certain ways, depending upon how you define advanced civilizations that I've seen, are the Mauritanians, which are some of the simplest people in the world, which until 15, 20 years ago, they were still literally Bedouins, nomads, moving from place to place, wherever the water might be, depending upon the season and rainfall and so forth. And that despite they're the second poorest country in the world, at least that was a statistic from some time ago, but despite that they were an amazing people that had traits that I haven't seen in the most civilized people, and that people that I developed intimate relationship with. The man that I converted with, his name was Shaykh Khatri Baybba, that his half-sister was the wife of Murabit al Hajj. May Allah have mercy upon her. She's passed. Murabit al Hajj is still alive. And that he to me was like a father. And I remember that when I first wanted to go to Mauritania, oh my God, yeah, that's a whole story in itself with my parents. You're leaving, you're pay for education to go to UC Berkeley and this future. And what my mom always wanted for me is to live in a nice white picket fence and have, 2 children and live the American dream and so forth. All of a sudden, I'm going to Africa, where I'm not going to be able to speak to her except to every 2 or 3 months. And she, literally, like, she didn't take that too well at first. And that I remember when they first met my teacher, Shaykh Khatri, that he was reassuring them that I would be safe and so forth. And he said, we're going to take better care of them than you do. And that literally, though, that it was like a father-son type relationship. It's very intimate, and that's very, it's very unique. It was the student-teacher relationship, which you find that sometimes in the university, but in the Muslim world, much more prominent, where there's a very intimate, close-knit student-teacher relationship, and that it's very important to the whole process of learning and the internalization of the realities and the ultimate purpose of knowledge. Anyhow, that taking this back to what we were discussing, is that so people don't often have the ability to divorce themselves from judging the past based upon the lives in which we live. And I would argue that people that they don't realize how that the majority of human beings have not walked this earth and lived like the way that we live. If you even look at the remaining people that lived, in the early 20th century, in the early 1900s, there's a few of them still around. That what was their realities? What was the reality of life in the United States of America before the radio, before electricity, right, before airplanes, let alone before internet and so many of these other things, satellites, cell phones, and so forth. What was their lives like? What was the way that they used to live? And that, let alone when you get a little bit further back in history, the majority of human beings that have walked the face of this earth, we're coming at the very end of everything. And that the majority of humans live very differently. And that in order for you to understand oftentimes the way that worked, you have to understand that the dynamics of that particular juncture in history. So one example of that is that if you want to talk about, we have a breakdown that is not a Qur'anic breakdown, but it's a scholarly breakdown that came later, of dividing the Muslim polity and then in relation to non-Muslim polity, that into categories such as Dar al-Islam, the abode of Islam, Dar al-Kufr, the abode of disbelief, Dar al-Harb, the abode of war. And there's a lot of scholarly difference upon this. You also have other abodes as well. Dar al-Aman, the abode of security, Dar al-Mu'ahada, the abode of treaty. You have different abodes. And that, that was very much a part of the pre-modern world. And that you could see the functional aspect of this type of division. Because the way that societies and civilizations that not only survived but prospered and spread, that you have to understand the way that was, in order to understand the importance of that breakdown. And now, the challenge is that as we've moved into a time where so many things have broken down, that this is the most important time of all, that we have nuanced scholarship that can look into these details and so forth. And I know that this is not what you wanted me to speak about, so I'll try to get to what you said. But I wanted to, but really, I think it's really important, that we all learn to love knowledge, and that we enjoy intellectual stimulation, where we think and we're people of depth, and that I would say that in response to that that this issues of this sort that need to be addressed. Is that we're living in a time that requires nuance. And that one of the tendencies of different people that you find in our time is that as the challenges escalate, is that you see certain responses to these various challenges. You know, one of the great challenges, if you want us to be honest, that we're dealing with is certain people within our communities. That their response to, you know, I'm calling it modernity, whatever that means, is that they want to run from it, they don't want to engage in it, and they want to create black and white dichotomies that there's clarity in their mind and they live and die upon that. Now, if someone's going to do that and that remain within their own realm and to not engage, you know, I personally don't have a problem with that. Because you can't require everyone to engage and to have calculated integration. And if someone wants to do that, you know, we have Amish people that, you know, reject much of modernity. We have, you know, people that go and form intentional communities and they don't want to have anything to do with the public sphere, and that's fine. Right? We shouldn't force everyone to be the same way. If someone, that's just their response, I don't have a problem with that. However, that if you universalize your approach, and then even worse, try to justify religiously that the way that you're viewing things that is the only way to respond, and everyone else who doesn't respond that way is wrong, inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. Right? You are setting yourself up for disaster within your own selves and within other people as well. You know, and this is really at the heart of that, you know, one of the major tendencies within our community of that, you know, this problem of, you know, I don't know what you want to term it now, but it's related to, you know, creating these false dichotomies. Is that in a time where things become extremely complex, is that you're, to the degree of its complexity, is to the degree that you're in need of nuance. And that what I would say to that is that you could analyze, you know, the trial, which what we call in Arabic a fitna. But the very definition of a fitna is that you can understand that it's a trial, but there's no easy way out. Right? So, for instance, that, you know, a leader like Saddam Hussein, in everything that he did to his people, and so forth and so on, that you can understand that all Muslims would say, virtually, you know, that he's a tyrant and this and that, and so forth and so on. But, you know, how do you get yourself out of that situation? And what is the alternative to that civilization? This is something that now is taking place right now as we speak in the Muslim world. This is right at the surface, where you see all of these varying perspectives in relation to the Arab Spring and so forth, and this new stage now of governance in the Muslim world, and how that relates to the West, and how that relates to democracy, and so forth and so on. And I'm not going to give any definitive answers. All of my point is that you can understand the trial. But oftentimes the very definition of a fitna, of a trial, is that there is no easy way out. Because that is exactly what it is. It's a trial. You know, and we have in our lives various types of trials. There's certain relationships that you have. That you might have a family member that, you know, just irks you and is troubling you, and it's just a thorn in your side constantly. And it's a trial. You know what you can and can't do on the two extremes. Right? You don't have to subjugate yourself to any type of emotional, physical, or verbal abuse or anything of that sort. At the same time, they're family, nor can you completely cut them off. Right? Where is the fine line of how you deal with that? Or sometimes it's with your parents. Other times it's a spouse and their husband, the husband and wife, the two spouses. And they have kids, and there's no options for divorce because it would lead to a disaster, but you're trapped in the relationship. So you can identify oftentimes with a fitna, with a tribulation, the two extremes. But determining how you actually navigate, you know, the middle, that oftentimes is something that is very difficult. And that it's important, though, that when this is the case, is that we have a nuanced outlook. And that one of the things about the Islamic tradition, that it's extremely, extremely vast. And I don't think people realize the contributions, the civilizational contributions that Muslims have made, in particular that are scholarly tradition, and some of them unique civilizational contributions, like the science of Islamic legal theory, usul al-fiqh. The Islamic legal theory is a unique science, it's a unique contribution, and that it developed at a particular juncture in Islamic history. And that the primary founder of it was the great Imam Muhammad ibn Idris al-Shafi'i in his work Al-Risala. And that what he focused on, as opposed to many of the other books of fiqh, that focus on the branch rulings that relate to law as it's understood in light of the Quran and Sunnah, meaning the statements and practices and tacit approvals of our Prophet ﷺ, that he got to the heart of the overarching principles through which that the individual rulings of the laws are derived. But if you see someone who's a master of usul al-fiqh, that they also, generally speaking, will be a master of theology. They will also be a master of grammar and rhetoric. That oftentimes they would have expanded into a knowledge of philosophy. And that they have this unique skill set that really what would be somewhat similar, as close as you're going to find within the Islamic tradition, to what would be called a liberal arts education of the West. Because the Western tradition, that the roots of it was based in the trivium and the quadrivium. The trivium being that grammar, rhetoric, and logic, and the quadrivium being geometry, arithmetic, astronomy, and music. You know, these were the 7 foundational knowledges that was a part of a liberal arts curriculum. Right? And this is what essentially the institution I teach for is Zaytuna College, is that what they're attempting to do, that they're trying to create a Muslim liberal arts college in the United States, where it is trying to attempt, because this is a big claim, no one's claiming anything, attempt to bridge the gap between the Western tradition and the Islamic tradition in light of our context here in the United States, and to try to contribute unique, Islamic solutions to, many of the problems that we face as human beings and as humanity. And that, what exactly that means, it's not concrete, and there's no ready answers. This is a long topic of discussion that takes years upon years of integration and reassessment to actually come to any level of solidification of a curriculum and understandings in that. Anyways, that our science of Islamic legal theory is really interesting. But which one of us has even studied a basic text of Islamic legal, or even heard about its importance? And this, to me, I would argue, is one of the most important sciences that we need to study in light of our time. Because that once you understand what are called the maqasid of Sharia, which are the principles of law, it's loosely related to usul al-fiqh, that you start to understand that all of the individual rulings of the law relate to these overarching principles. And some scholars say they're 5, others say they're 6. But it's related to preservation of religion, preservation of life, preservation of intellect, preservation of property, preservation of lineage, and what's the 6th? Honor, the preservation of honor. Thank you. So those are the overall, so meaning that every detailed ruling of the sacred law relates to one of these 5 in one way or another. And so then what you have to do is that as our scholars have said, that al-hukm far'un an tasawwurihi, for you to make a judgment on something, to give an opinion. So this whole idea of what's your opinion, brother? What's your opinion, sister? Where everyone's just kind of, giving their opinion in this type of way. That, yes, everyone's entitled to their opinion, but in the end, you should have an informed opinion. That you should have thought about it, and it should be an opinion based upon knowledge and conviction, right? Not just taqleed, where you heard someone else say it, and so that, I can't see your side, 10. That not just what someone else said, and that's it. Right? But what you see is that, which I just really want to get at, and we'll open the door for questions, is that the way that it's nuanced. Because then, is that you have to examine things based upon their masalih and their mafasid. That you have certain things that are benefits, and you then have certain things that are harms. And the way that you apply law in any times is that you have individual rulings of the Sharia that each relate to one of these 5 or 6 overarching principles, which, that if we can take attention real quickly, that everything from this perspective, every individual law, even if you don't understand it, that it's rational, given the aforementioned assumptions. Now, when you're dealing with secular law, it has a different set of assumptions that someone might deem what you believe to be irrational. But looking at it from an internal perspective, that's not the case. It is rational, given that it's related to one of these 5 or 6 things. But then what happens is that as you try to analyze and respond to the various challenges in your time, is that it requires a very in-depth knowledge of these overarching principles and how it relates to their presentation, and interpreting that the challenge of your time in light of this tradition, and that giving precedence to the benefits as it over the harms. And that what you'll find is that it's fairly easy to determine that right from wrong in a very general sense. That when something, the Quran rejects moral relativism. We understand what's right, we understand what's wrong in certain things. Al-halal bayn wal-haram bayn. But that at another degree, that understanding what is the righter of 2 rights, if you could say that, or the wronger of 2 wrongs, or that what takes more precedence to focus on in terms of your list of priorities, or that how to deal in a situation when that no matter what the outcome, it's not something, good. That either way, that it's not going to be the perfect or desirable outcome. How to deal with that situation, which is a good percentage of the situations that we deal with on an individual basis, on a community basis, or as such. And this is why that it's so important to be nuanced, because either way, we're all making decisions in our life. We're all making decisions, constantly. And that you're either just making your decisions haphazardly, right, or you're making informed decisions. We're all making decisions. And when it gets down to it, practically speaking, boom, we have to make a decision that oftentimes people don't have recourse, or even if they do, they don't go back to even, have people that have an informed opinion help them in that. And this is one of the challenges as well, is that the number of informed people that are grounded in tradition, at the same time understand the nuances of the modern world, are few and far between. And if they're there, they're hard to reach, or they might not respond to your emails. Right. Anyways, that we're saying all this is that I think it's really important that we develop a nuanced understanding of our tradition, and that we rise to the intellectual challenge that in a time of difficulty is that the worst thing that you could do is create a false dichotomy. Is that what you have to do is that further the depths of your knowledge, and to understand things from a very subtle perspective. And that when you start to see that the way that a scholar that analyzed one particular ruling, for instance, in all of the considerations that were there, it will leave you in a state of complete awe. And that, that one example of that, not a concrete example, but a general example of that is that when, for instance, when our great jurists, like Imam Malik, like Imam Shafi'i, like Imam Abu Hanifa, like Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal, is that when they were considering a particular ruling in the sacred law, is that they didn't only consider that based upon one source, whether it be a verse of the Quran or a hadith of the Prophet. Rather, they consider that point, that individual ruling, in light of the entirety of the Quran, into the extent of their knowledge of the corpus of hadith. Because oftentimes we'll have different rulings that appear to be contradictory, or that have various levels of authenticity in narration. What do you do in that particular scenario? And likewise, they would also take into consideration that the way that that individual ruling relates to other individual rulings that they've already come to basic conclusions on. And so that this is why that there's definitely things that missed earlier scholars that later scholars picked up on. Is because that previous scholar might not have taken everything into consideration. Where the later scholar came and had the privilege to, because it was developed to a certain level, that they could think about those other considerations. So we tend to think at times that, you know, an example of that is you take a Qur'anic verse, and that it's one level to understand what is the literal meaning of that verse. It's another level to take into consideration why that Allah mentioned that in that particular way and didn't mention it in other ways. Right? That opens up a whole other aspect of knowledge, and it requires a greater depth. You know, I go mind blank. What did you want me? What was the essence of what we? No, but what did we talk about when we were walking? I want to just touch on it real briefly.
Maturity.
There you are. And so that's how I wanted to basically approach this topic about, you know, that maturity, you know, and that it was asked to speak about, you know, something related to that, and I think it from the Fakir's perspective, it relates to what I mentioned, is that we need to become mature in that sense, is that we need to get beyond, you know, a lot of this, you know, very simplistic remedial type of discourse that is dividing our community. And I'm making this address in particular now to the Muslim community, is that we all know what is taking place at the masjid level, at the community level, and oftentimes at the MSA level, where that the level of discourse that people are preoccupying themselves with and arguing over is so petty, given the overall perspective, that it's just beyond me, actually, if you want me to be honest. You know, and to me, that as a convert to Islam, that I refuse to be bogged down by the baggage of our Muslim community. Now, I don't mean by that I'm going to divorce myself from Muslim community. Some people choose to do that because they think it's just rather than deal with all this stuff, right? I'm just going to become Muslim and just khalas, just, you know, remain on the fringes, maybe, you know, attend Jummah and leave, and just, I don't want people. Some people don't want to be a part of it, and that's fine. I don't choose that position. You know, I think that we need to work within the Muslim community while working within the greater community, but at the same time, is that we have to look 50 to 100 years down the line, and that accessing our tradition, understanding how that Islam is really going to become relative in our society, you know, especially for Muslims. You know, and what are the ways that we're going to navigate that living in a modern, liberal, secular democracy? And what does that mean? You know, getting beyond, like, Islam's against democracy, or this type of thing. Like, to, like, really, like, what is democracy? What are the different types of democracy? That, do we have anything similar in our tradition to democracy? That, what is Islamic political theory? Some argue there is no such thing, because that we only have a few books, and they're extremely short, about political theory, which is very interesting. That, does Islam have something to say about politics? Absolutely. But let's just say what we know about it, how relevant is that overall to what we want to be doing here anyway? You know, and we need to get beyond, you know, this petty discourse, where we really get down to the heart of certain issues. And a lot of that, you know, is maturity. And that requires an intellectual maturity. And it requires simultaneously a spiritual maturity. Because oftentimes people's that spiritual immaturity, meaning the state that they're in, prevents them from that developing this intellectual maturity. And to really fairly, justly, but open-heartedly accessing that our legacy that our scholars have left behind, and that the great Muslims, scholars, and awliya, saints that preceded before us, and that to me that this is something that I live my life by, and I have to say that from this standpoint, is that the more you delve into it, subhanAllah, the more beautiful it becomes. And the more that you realize the vastness of the ocean and how, the depths of the sea, and that in reality it's a shoreless sea, that it's amazing. And that there's just so many ideas that can be flushed out. And there's so many historical examples that, and I'll end on this last note, and it relates particularly, one of the main concepts that I would argue we have to understand if we're going to have intellectual maturity, and in a sense spiritual maturity, that we have to understand the universality of Islam. Because Muslims believe that our Prophet was a universal prophet. Right? And that to me, it's amazing that you have, geographically speaking, the Arabian Peninsula was one of the least universal places. Now, from one perspective, that we call Mecca al-Qura, the mother of cities, or idiomatic translation, the embryonic city. And if you look at the landmass of the different continents, that for the most part, even though not longitudinally, but in terms of the landmass, it is in the center, with the exception of Antarctica. It is very much in the center. But the Arabian Peninsula was an impenetrable sanctuary for much of history, and that's part of the geographic miracle, of the Prophet's teachings and Islam, which is an incredible topic that some have researched, like Dr. Omar, and that, however, that this was one of the ways in which the pristine Arabic tongue was preserved, because of the lack of interaction, as opposed to a city like Jerusalem, and that the multifarious influences on anything in a given moment, religious belief or otherwise. But the thing is that once you understand the universality of Islam and how it pertains to the entire world and every time from the time of our Prophet and to every subsequent generation to the end of time, and all peoples on the face of this world, is that theoretically speaking, is that Muslims believe that Islam is for all times and for all people. But you oftentimes find in individual Muslims very narrow perspectives that they can't even deal with people in their own masjid, right? Let alone with the greater Muslim community. But our Prophet, this is something you can be certain of, is that his universal nature would have allowed him to deal with every single human being in his time until Yom Qiyamah. To people that when you go outside, and believe me, I see these people in Berkeley, that some of the most distant people from the fitrah, the natural state of the human being, that think that they, this is the way that they should be lived, and the way that they pierce themselves and marred their own skin, and tattoos and substances that they consume and so forth and so on. That the Prophet would have had an ability, theoretically speaking, to interact with everyone. And that, theoretically, everyone would have found something in the Prophet, an aspect of his identity, of his personality, of who he was, that would attract them. And then ultimately the higher levels of spiritual development is to the extent that you mold yourself to the prophetic personage, is to the extent that you obtain divine guidance, but that the universality of Islam is very important. And that if we can understand that when you understand how Islam spread to the Persian, how Islam spread to the Indian subcontinent, how Islam spread to Egypt, how Islam spread to North Africa, how Islam spread to Southern Europe and Spain, how Islam spread to the Southeast Asia and the Malay world, how Islam spread to Sub-Saharan Africa, how Islam spread to China, in Central Asia and then China. And then that what is the way that those people that integrated Islam based upon their own cultural heritage. And this is an incredible topic that requires an immense amount of knowledge, an immense amount of research, but things are coming out. But this is part of the intellectual challenge that we need to have the courage to look into and to see what are the various parallels to our own situation here and what are some ideas that we can draw from into some of the challenges that we're facing. So that's about all that I have to say. I guess we can open up the.
We can take a few questions.
Any questions?
I actually have a question. As a student here, I was reflecting and thinking about my time here at UCLA and in MSA. And as a student, there's a lot of things going on in your mind. You're very concerned about your career, doing well in school, developing relationships with friends, and the MSA and the activism and all that you're doing. And so sometimes the Islamic studies, it's almost like it takes a back seat, pursuing Islamic knowledge, memorizing Quran, doing other things, because it's difficult to fit that in when you're so concentrated on so many other things. And that's why I really understood this to be a confusing time for a lot of students, especially the environment we're in. And also, there's certain groups, and there's a certain attraction to the simplicity that we see in Islam, or the simplicity that is offered by certain speakers, and it makes it very easy for a student, especially to take that simplicity and practice on a daily level, on a daily life, and that's what the attraction is. What you mentioned, I like what you mentioned about the nuance and the priorities. A lot of times we look at the nuance in everything else except in Islam. We're very concentrated into our classes. We sit and we can listen to professors speak for on, and whatever subject we're on. But when it comes to Islam, it's very difficult for us to sit and learn for some reason. We want it to be fed to us, and we don't want to take that step to pursue it, although we're taking those steps in every area of our life except Islam. And I think it's because...
So do you have a question?
No. So what
Always is a lawyer.
So
if there was a judge in the room, then you would ask him, like, do you have a question?
So I usually address Your Honor when I'm the chair. My question is...
No, I got your question.
Yeah,
so,
so
Yani, what do we do about that, basically?
Exactly.
Yani,
what are the priorities we should take?
Right, exactly. No, I think it's just very clear that ultimately that it's all about balance. And that it's very important to simultaneously focus upon our intellectual development in a religious Islamic sense, while simultaneously broadening the horizons of our mind in a general ed or postgraduate degree type education, and at the same time not forgetting spirituality. And the key to all of that is to learn how to divide your time wisely, which is very hard to do. And that there's a lot of things out there to distract us, especially at the college level. And this relates to maturity in that sense, is that you have a choice. That you could go out and party, you could go out and do other things. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't have halal fun, lawful fun. But what I'm saying is that people do make choices, and that I would say that the state of the believer is that we're very serious people. That we have a very clear-cut perspective on life, and that we have to have times where we laugh, we have to have times where we relax and go to the beach, and we have to have times where we, have downtime. That's a given. But that one of the golden principles I've heard from my teachers is that you have to be latif in your jid, and you have to be mujid in your lutf. Is that you have to be gentle in your times of seriousness, and you have to be serious in your times of gentleness. Right? And that to the extent that you can do that and live a life of purpose, that you'd be surprised. Imam al-Ghazali says that we have 24 hours in our day, and that if you're sleeping 8 hours a day, that's a third of your life gone, and you have 16 hours left. Okay, let's say you cut back on your sleep a little bit. Anyways, that you have a very limited amount of time during the day. But if you learn to organize your time wisely, and that you learn to place certain things at certain times, that you'll learn to get the blessing, of your time. And that there's people that have barakah, they have blessing in their time. And again, it always gets back to the golden principle of balance. And so by arranging your time correctly and sticking to that to the extent possible, that you will find blessing in your time, and that you will you will be open to achieving in a number of ways. And to me, in the end, that as hard as school is and as demanding as it is, it's not always like that. Usually people don't do work anyway until the end of the semester, that. But the point is that it's about priorities. And in a sense, you have to have priorities in your life. And that if you set your priorities right, and you make sure that there's certain things that you definitely do, that again, cater to your, that you have times where you study, you have times where you focus on devotions, you have times for exercise, you have times you spend with your friends. That I think it really gets back to having a high aspiration and arranging your time wisely. And also benefiting a lot from your free time. But also, you have 4 months off. You have a month off in the winter, and you have 3 months off in the summer, for the most part. How do you use that time? What is it, the things that you do? And that you'll find a lot of the complaints get back to a misuse of your time, which again gets back to this idea of maturity. I don't know if someone else might have a comment or something that they want to say.
I have a question. So at the very beginning of your talk, you mentioned that Islam teaches to seek truth. Okay. In the Christian world, the way to seek truth is basically read the Bible, pray, and the Holy Ghost reveals truth to you. Now, I found that that's not a real good mechanism because you have a lot of different denominations, Jehovah's Witness, LDS, Protestant, that all believe very different things. And I think it's absurd that God would tell one person that there's one truth and another Christian person that there's another truth. So how does Islam teach to find truth? How do you know that that Muhammad's a prophet, that the Quran's truthful, that sort of thing?
Well, that's a very good question. And I think that it could be answered in a number of ways. But what I would say is, first of all, that truth with a capital T, that there's different aspects of truth. So if we would hone in on one aspect of truth, which let's say the existence of God, that the Muslim perspective on that is that the belief in God is a divine gift. It's something that God gives you or He doesn't give you. It's a divine gift. And at the same time, when we were talking about from a theological point of view of learning proofs, rational proofs, that even if you learn a lot of rational proofs, which are very much a part of the Christian tradition as well. So you look at Aquinas, he had rational proofs, and there's different types of rational proofs. But when was the last time that you offered a rational proof to an atheist that then believed it and became a believer? That's very rare. Right? The whole purpose of rational proofs is to buttress faith that you've been given. And so from an Islamic perspective, that human beings are born believers. Meaning that the natural default state of the human being is that the human being is a believer. And that through entering into the world, that there's, through various types of exposure to different things, that we learn aberrant ideas that take us away from the truth. And that the default state, however, is that were you to have a certain society, that a child is raised in a particular way, that they would naturally believe in certain things. And up on the top of the list is a basic belief of cause and effect, which ultimately is one of the great ways to lead you to believe in God. Right? So that we would consider it from this perspective that the human being is homo religiosus, meaning that we are believers by nature. And that from a more philosophical perspective is that in Islam, that when we talk about certainty and we talk about truth as opposed to falsehood, that truth is defined simply as that which is and necessarily must be. Whereas falsehood by definition is that which is not and necessarily must not be. And so certainty, according to Islam, is a person aligning himself with the very way that things are. And so it's that process of, in a sense, self-discovery that one allows them to align themselves. And so what I mean by that is that there's mechanisms that assist the human being in that, but it requires a desire within the human being to be able to have it become unfolded to them, the seed of potentiality to know truth that exists within them. And I'm not just using fancy words to confuse you. I'm really serious about this. That we believe that the human being has the seed within them to know truth. And that what happens is that if any human being that really wants to come to discover that seed of potentiality and takes the practical steps to do that, that's all the human being can do ultimately, is to want to have that desire to come to the truth and then embark upon a path to seek it. And what I would say is that a good percentage of the people in our time don't take the questions of ultimate concern seriously. A good percentage of human beings, especially in our time, where that if we really truly were rational people, that we would be preoccupied about the major questions in life. Where do we come from? What is the purpose of our life here? And where are we going? And I would argue that the majority of people don't really take that seriously. They might have certain windows where there's a death in the family, or they have a near-death experience, or for a period of time they think about it, but then that because that we also are scared to deal with the unknown, the unknowability of what happens after death is the most terrifying thing to the human being. To not exist, or to potentially not exist, or this unknown of transferring into another realm. This is one of the scariest aspects of the human being. So that there is a objective standard, though, to demonstrate truth and to observe truth, and that it's done in two ways. Is that the foundation of it is that human desire and the decisions that we make, right, to take that path to attain truth. And that there's the second level, which is the realm of the intellect, where we can objectify and objectively know whether something is accordance with the intellect or it's not in accordance with the intellect. But the higher levels of knowledge of the truth, that it is experiential without doubt. But it's experiential but buttressed by the intellect. And one of the greatest of the normative theologians of Islam, Imam al-Zahi, this was his great contribution. His great contribution, this is why he's called Hujjat al-Islam, the proof of Islam, is that he said that in terms of our epistemology, the way in which we come to know, that there's what is called the Lawh al-Mahfuz. And this is a technical term, but he says that this is what is known as the preserved tablet. And Muslims believe that in the preserved tablet, that all of the divine decrees that have been written for everything that happened, everything that will happen, exist within the Lawh al-Mahfuz. And that epistemology he was very concerned with. And what he says is that the higher level of knowledge ultimately is that the heart is like a mirror. And it has the potential ability to reflect that which is in the Lawh al-Mahfuz, the preserved tablet, which is what is and what will be. And he mentions 5 different barriers through which, and we won't go into those details, that the heart, because it's like a mirror, might not reflect that which is in the preserved tablet. And then on top of that, that once that heart is reflected, or once that reality is reflected in the heart, that it's through this, what his doctrine of what he calls experience, or though, that a human being comes to a higher level of knowledge of reality. So that Muslims would agree from one perspective that there is a super rational element to that, but it doesn't neglect as well that the buttressing of intellect. So in relation to the question as it pertains to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, that there's various ways of ascertaining the proof of his prophecy. One that we know is that in a historical sense, in terms of the historicity of the Qur'an and the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, it's an entirely different phenomenon than the historicity of Jesus, and let alone the prophets of the Hebrew scriptures. It's a very different process, and that to lump Muslim scripture with the New Testament and the Old Testament offends Jews, so we'll say the Hebrew scriptures, is a big mistake because it's a different phenomenon entirely, and that we have copies of the Quran that were from the earliest time, from the different copies that were codified by Uthman, who was the famous caliph. The entire Quran was written down on the type of the Prophet. And that if we look at the various scriptures, the New Testament and the Old Testament, that we didn't have it. The oldest version of the Old Testament that we have is 10th century. So it's a totally different phenomenon. They don't even know that, what type of Hebrew that Moses even really spoke. Hebrew became a dead language. They used Muslim dictionaries to, revowelize, the Hebrew language. And the same thing is when you get into Hindu scripture as well as others. And the point is that I think it's very clear that there's certain historical elements of Islam that are very different, and that we know that there was a historical element of the Prophet existing. And there's other ways to prove it from outside the Islamic tradition. But in the end, that one of the greatest ways to ascertain the veracity of the Prophet is that when you expose yourself to his teachings. And his teachings are very clear-cut. They're there before us. And that using your intellect to understand his teachings. For me, one of the main things that did it for me is that one of the things that I was troubled with was that, again, related to what you're saying, the various claims of truth. And to me, I grew up in an Episcopalian tradition. And that, there were certain problems that I had with certain tenets of faith in Christianity. That, I didn't believe Jesus was the Son of God. I didn't believe in the Trinity. I had trouble with original sin and others. I had troubles with the historicity of the Bible. And that, that to me I was abhorred by someone claiming that, the King James translation was the literal word of God. And not even, Jesus, he might have spoken Greek and known a little Greek, but he spoke Aramaic. So how to explain that the early scriptures were in Greek when he spoke Aramaic? And the earliest of the four synoptic gospels was not compiled until the year 70 AD. And how do we explain the discrepancies? And, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And then we have the Gospel of John, which is the fourth main gospel. How do we explain that? To me, that was very troubling. Anyways, that one of the things that really opened up my mind was to me that, religion, if it's true, it has to be true with a capital T. That it has to give you an overarching perspective, the way that you're going to understand everything. And that was the main thing that did it for me in Islam, especially when I learned that Muslims believe in all prophets and messengers. To me, one of the greatest testimonies of the veracity of our Prophet is that the names of Jesus and Muhammad are mentioned in the Quran, of Jesus and Moses are mentioned in the Quran much more than the name of the Prophet Muhammad. And that there's an acceptance of human history collectively, that Muslims are required to believe in every single prophet and messenger that was sent to mankind. And that there's 25 that the Quran mentions explicitly. And there's certain narrations that indicate there was a total of 124,000 prophets. And there's certain narrations that indicate there was 313 or 314 or 15 messengers, but it's not definitive. But meaning that we believe that every people was sent a prophet. And to me, that, was like, wow. That you need to tell me that I can understand that everything that happened before, based upon that perspective, because you can. And that now the details on how you fill in the blanks, that oftentimes becomes difficult, because the Native Americans definitely had prophets. But what remained from the prophetic teachings in the various understandings of the various tribes, that might be difficult to ascertain without, revelation. But these type of things that they're clearly things that relate to the realm of the intellect, but at the same time that they point to another aspect of the veracity of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. And you combine that to his teachings, that when you access them and you see the change in your own life, one of the main reasons people believe in religion is because it works for them. It works for them, and they see the transformation in their life. Now, I wouldn't define that only in itself, but that is definitely, a consideration. And then when you add that to the intellectual sphere, as well as, the super rational, which is based upon experience after that, then I think that there's clear impetus that leads to a very objectifiable version of truth. And that the thing that I will say on top of all of that is that when you've had experiences with people that are living links in this chain that go back to the Prophet Muhammad, that this is one of the main reasons why people come to believe, is their interaction with other human beings, and which might not oftentimes be the most rational from that perspective. But this is one of this is number one of the 5 reasons why people convert, is interacting with others, other Muslims. and this is could be a phenomenon as well related to other types of knowledge. But it's kind of a long answer, but that's just thoughts and thoughts.
Are there any more questions?
Sisters? Sisters, any questions, sisters?
Concerning history and concerning what you mentioned about seeking intellectual stimulation and discourse. So from what I know and have read, knowledge itself in the past, say in the what many people call the classical golden age of Islam, knowledge, whether it was theology, literature, law, politics, science, medicine, astronomy, etc. They were, the way I see it, they were in one scope, and Muslim scholars of the past, they were polymaths or Renaissance men who had mastery. People like Imam Ghazali, Ibn Sina, Ibn Rushd, Ibn al-Haytham, and all these other scientists and scholars. So they were these polymaths and Renaissance man. So what my question is, what caused this big sphere of knowledge to break down into religion religion, theology, and you could say metaphysics, philosophy on one side, and practical science and other things on the other side. And concerning that, there was an astrophysicist, Professor Neil deGrasse Tyson, who's an agnostic, and he's a contemporary of Richard Dawkins. But he said this. He said that if Muslim knowledge had not collapsed like this, and you took the total population of Muslims, and you calculated, so he compared the Muslim population to the Jewish population, and said the Jewish population is this much, yet this is how many Nobel Prizes or big discoveries they have made. Now, if you took the Muslim population, and which is much larger than the Jewish population, and Islamic knowledge had not broken down in the past, how many Nobel Prizes do you think
Would Muslims have won?
would have won? Yes. So my question is, first, what caused the breakdown of this knowledge, and second is, what can I or anyone else do pragmatically right now and in the long run?
We're going to be here for 2 weeks to answer your question. Develop a whole course. I'm serious. That's a whole course in study, and I don't know if I'm the most qualified to answer that question, because that's a huge topic. We have to know our limits. But I don't know whether to say that, except maybe basically that you could say that you're absolutely right that Muslims had a very unique perspective to knowledge, and that I kind of held back the reins today talking in the clip because I didn't want to say anything that would be deemed controversial, but I think I can probably say it in this context. Is that for us, that all pursuit of knowledge is a sacred pursuit, because the name of Allah, one of his names is Al-Alim, he's the all-knowing. And so for us, all pursuit of knowledge, whether it be related to the human being, whether it be related to the cosmos and everything that's in it, and all of the other breakdowns, biology, chemistry, physics, geology, and so forth and so on, whether it be related to the understanding of God, which is termed theology, all of the spheres of what could potentially be known, that for us it's all a sacred. It's all a sacred pursuit. And what we mean by that is that there's no knowledge that cannot not be integrated, to use a double negative, into that a vision of Tawheed. Is that for us, is that absolutely there's a relationship between all types of knowledge. There's a relationship between all types of knowledge that pertain to the human being in a physiological sense, in a psychological sense, in an emotional sense, overall related to the human being. And then there's a relationship between those knowledges that pertain to the human being and the greater cosmos at the micro level and the macro level, and that there's definitely a relationship between both those two types of knowledge to the Creator. Because these are the three spheres, in a sense, of knowledge: man, cosmos, God. And what is the relationship between the three? This is the quest of human pursuits, throughout human history. And so Muslims, understood that very clearly. And Muslim scientists, and even what you mentioned, Muslim philosopher scientists, because many of them were philosophers and scientists, like the Sina and others, that they had different focuses, obviously. But they were working, even though at times that they diverted from a traditional perspective, that they were working on a theocentric perspective. And meaning that they were relating everything overall, ultimately, to God. And emanation theory within Sina clearly shows that. And that, so that was definitely the case. And that the details of what exactly happened and how that broke down, that's a very complicated story. Some of the versions I don't accept. Like some people say that Imam al-Ghazali came along and that it was going fine, and then that was it. I mean, it's such, really, there's people that say that. I've actually watched videos that say that, and there's people that, and that's not true. The proof of it is that Imam al-Ghazali synthesized philosophy, and it went on, and it still exists to this day. There's still places in the Muslim world where it's taught, traditional philosophy, and that's you can't say that. There's a number of there's historical precedent for that. Because if we look at the heyday of what's termed in the West the Golden Age, which I wouldn't term it that, but where you have like the Bayt al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, you have the translation of all these texts from the Greek tradition, and from Sanskrit also into Arabic, sometimes via other languages like Syriac and so forth, and these the center where various traditions are being translated ultimately into Arabic, in which Muslims are being exposed to various civilizations in the world. That Muslims were never scared to do that, to embark upon this intellectual quest. But what was important for them is the integration of that knowledge, but based upon certain principles of integration, and that it was what was integrated and how it was integrated, which was important. And so that when you have, for instance, cases like Mahmoud who sponsored that, pass and cease, that oftentimes those that came after them didn't have the same intellectual pursuits. So that's definitely a contributing factor. And that there's many other contributing factors as well. And it might have been that there was more focus placed upon certain realms of intellectual pursuit than others. But, I would argue in principle that, it's important, that whatever happened had to happen. One thing I will say, though, is that, and I'll get to the last part of what do we do now, is that one thing I will say, though, is that in the Western sense, is that in the Renaissance, and what happened there, and during the time of the Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment, which again is a huge topic of inquiry, that what you started to see happen is that we forget there was what was called natural theology, where most of the first scientific pursuits were based upon a worldview of belief in God, and that when certain findings seemed to contradict, apparently with traditional Catholic doctrine, that this was definitely one of the reasons of the split of revelation and reason, and the way that that's interconnected to the Reformation and the splitting. There's the Great Schism that was in, 1092 between the Greek Orthodox and the Catholic Church, but then later the Reformation, where you had the Protestant Reformation, that there were several reasons for that. One of them was this whole idea of the clergy, and that as it pertains to knowledge and access to that knowledge. So you have in the West that what started to develop there was a divorce between that intellectual inquiry and revelation, because there were certain things that were there was no way to reconcile what they came to understand scientifically and what was a part of doctrine in church, and that was definitely one of the reasons, and there's much more nuance than that, and there's many more. So that one of the important questions we have to ask is that there's a particular worldview behind modern science. And to me, it's a total mistake for Muslims to think that we have to jump on board and have more Nobel Prize winners. To me, I don't accept that, right? Because there's certain things that are definitely in conflict. That in terms of underlying assumptions and the way that knowledge is viewed, that we would never fully agree with. Then that brings up another question that, what do we do? And so I'm very critical of kind of the modernist Muslim type approach, which thinks that, the result is to, just become more scientific. That lest we forget the condition of the world, that one of the reasons the world is in the condition of it is because of the misuse of science. And that if you look at the way that, why is it in every department, why is it, this is one of the reasons why the Islamic Studies department are folded. This is one of the reasons why that all humanities departments nationwide, that they're starting to wane, right? Because they can't justify funding for them anymore, right? But the departments of biology, the departments, medicine, all of these things that where you can have some type of practical result, they're getting funded greatly. And that to me that's a serious concern. And one of the things that has happened that in this kind of post-enlightenment type attitude is that people have come to believe in technology, and that once the world itself has become desacralized, meaning that you no longer look at the world as a creation of God. Muslims distinguish between the dunya, which is the world in its lower sense, that distracts you from God, and between the alam, which is the cosmos, right? Which the cosmos comes from a Greek word that means ornament, and that in Arabic, the alam comes from alam. The world is seen as a sign, and we believe that everything in creation has a type of life. And so that once you remove a sacred view of nature, and such that it becomes that mechanistic, which is what has happened now, and this happened post-enlightenment, then that is all about manipulation. And so modern man's approach to science, and I'm not talking about your professor who's just into some type of experiment, you might have people that aren't actively taking part in this, but in general, that he wouldn't get funding for what he's trying to do unless there was some way to attach it to this overall objective. And so what I'm essentially trying to say is that modern technology in all of its different forms, that oftentimes that it's used ultimately to assert man's domination over Earth. And that is a very post-enlightenment theme, that Muslims that should have nothing to do with it. And that I would argue is very destructive, right, to the environment. It's very destructive to personal relationships. Right? If your whole purpose of doing science studies in neuroscience is to prove that the human being doesn't have a soul or spirit, and it's just about a bunch of flashing of neurons, and there's no reality to the spirit. To me, that you can never prove that, because we have to differentiate here between science and scientism. That science, as it's come to understood, is one thing, right? And there's different ways that science could potentially exist, which is another thing that people have never considered, because people are so close-minded. But scientism is something else entirely. And scientism is drawing metaphysical or philosophical implications from the findings of science, which is impossible. And it's the most illogical thing that you could possibly do, which is even the most acclaimed scientists do rigor, that they develop philosophical conclusions based on. So to me, that no matter how much that you prove that certain aspects of consciousness are related to the flashing of neurons and so forth, that you want to undermine the spirit, that it never does prove that. What it proves is that there's other physiological realities that relate to something that is beyond the material realm anyway. You can't disprove it. Right? And to me, science can never disprove God. And the whole reason science can never disprove God is because God is outside of the realm of science. Science is not focused upon that which is not a part of the tangible world. So how could it disprove or prove for that matter? It can't. It's impossible. What it can do from a standpoint of belief is it can point to God, that's what it is. It's an act. It's a signpost that points to the existence of God. And that if someone has the divine gift of faith, and then looks at the world from that perspective, and then that combined to the experiential component, which the reality of faith is a light that God places in your heart, all of it comes together. And it makes perfect sense. But that science can never disprove that. And so that I think as Muslims that we need to be very wary and very critical, and that when you step up to the plate, like to deal with these type of topics, right, you're dealing with 107-mile-an-hour fastballs. You're in the big leagues, and you're dealing with heavyweights. And this is why you have to educate yourself. And that I would love to do a degree, a PhD in physics. I really would. I love physics. There's only so much time that we have, but I love science. I love physics in particular. That's my inclinations. But that's my inclination. There's no time to do that. But if you're going to step up to refute, I'm just pointing to some very general ideas here. But if you step up the plate, you better put your, be ready for a heavyweight battle. And so we have to educate ourselves, and become well informed. And that the solution out of it, like any other fitna, is not easy. It's going to require a radical departure from the way that things are. To set up some type of analogy, though, let me say this, is that everyone's talking about globalism now. Like, the way that globalism is manifested in its current form is one possibility of its way it could manifest. There is multiple other ways that the world could have become globalized. That in our understanding globalism in the modern sense is tied to an economic system. And that you can't separate it from that. And that the way that the world is being globalized, such that you hop on a plane and you find people wearing the same, holy blue jeans, holy not in religious sense, that people are wearing in San Francisco before you hop on the plane, that creates a global monoculture which is based upon the eclipse of the intellect, and such that you have horizontal man, and I mean in generic sense, humankind, without any vertical dimension. That that to me is sad first and foremost, but secondly, that that's not the only way they could have happened. That there's a number of other ways. That Islam never created a monoculture ever, and that's why I would argue that the true question, this is based upon my teachers and what they say, is that can liberals tolerate Islam? That to me is really the question. Not the other way around. Can Islam tolerate liberals? And Sayyid Abdul Hakim has an article about that, if you want to read about that further, where he brings out some of the glorious aspects of the Ahl al-Dhimma, the Dhimmi system, which now is a great topic of debate. But it shows the very difference of that the modern liberal societies are the most intolerant societies in the world from a certain aspect. Right? They're very intolerant. If we're going to, one example of that is that if we're going to say everyone has the right to do what they want, why can't our Muslim sisters represent? Right? You have the right to do whatever you want. Why is there why are you considered to be why and on and on and on and on? That why does that even exist? So anyways, these are just some very basic insights. But the way out of it is that that we, number one, educate ourselves, and that we take a life of study and we find like-minded people, and we have the courage to go back into the depths and learn the necessary languages that you're going to need, the most important of which are Arabic and Persian, right? And so people want answers, but oftentimes they're not willing to put in the time to do it. And that we go back, we have thousands upon thousands of manuscripts that are incredible treatises of all different types of topics related to science, astronomy, medicine, and so forth. And that we analyze and we see the way it is done. And we start to question some of the underlying assumptions of modern science. And we start to poke holes in that. And we start to offer, other ways of doing the world. Now, that once you start to do that, you're going to be completely and totally sidelined. And that no one's going to publish your article. And no one, for the most part, is even going to listen to you. And they'll make personal and intellectual attacks night and day. But that's just part of living in the time which we live. So, at the same time, we need people to do that. And that's not making sense.
Barakallah feek, Shaykh Yahya. We're very honored and blessed to have you. Jazakallah khair for coming and saying your name. I'd like to close out, inshallah. I'd like you to close us out, inshallah, with a dua. And then for those of us that haven't prayed Isha, we'll go back to Kirkhoff and we'll pray Isha. So please conclude with dua.
ونعوذ بك من استعاذك من عبدك ونبيك محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وبارك الصالحين وأنت المستعان وعليك البلاء ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله اللهم نور بأبصارنا وبصائرنا وكلنا حقيقة اليقين والإيمان وثبتنا على لا إله إلا الله محمد رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم عليها نحيا وعليها نموت وعليها نبعث إن شاء الله من الفائزين ومن الموفقين ومن المقبولين ممن يرتقي بدرجات العلى إلى حضرتك وذكرك من حقائق الإيمان وحقائق اليقين اللهم وفقنا لما تحب وترضى واغفرنا بما كرمت به خواص عبادنا الصالحين وكرمنا بطول العمر في طاعتنا واجعل آخر كلامنا من الدنيا لا إله إلا الله محمد رسول الله متحققين بحقائقها ظاهرا وباطنا وجسما ومعنى لسير أسرار الفاتحة إياك صراط ربنا عليم وتب علينا يا رب وصلى الله عليه